the dust tasted of grit and endings, a fine, ochre powder settling into the creases of Ilara's worn dress, coating her tongue with the flavor of despair. For days, it had been her constant, unwelcome companion, a tangible reminder of the barren miles stretching behind her like a forgotten scar on the land, and the gnawing, hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence within her. The town, if such a collection of sun-scorched, wind-lashed shacks could earn the name, huddled under a merciless, white-hot sky, a bleached canvas stretched taut and unforgiving. Hope, a fragile bird she had clutched to her chest for so long it barely fluttered, had dwindled to this single, desperate act, to beg. He stood by the skeletal remains of a public water trough, its wood warped and split, a dark silhouette against the blinding afternoon light, his horse a muscular shadow beside him, flicking its tail at persistent flies. A lone rancher, the slatternly woman at the last miserable, fly-blown outpost had called him, her voice tinged with a mixture of fear and something akin to respect. A man who kept to himself, whose vast, untamed land bordered the raw, bleeding edge of nowhere. His name, they hadn't known, or perhaps, hadn't dared to speak, as if the utterance itself might summon an ill wind. Ilara approached, each step an immense effort, the worn, cracked leather of her thin-soled boots whispering a mournful cadence against the parched, unforgiving earth. Her throat was a tight, painful knot of burgeoning fear and corrosive shame, but hunger, she had learned, was a far more brutal, more insistent master. So. Her voice was a dry, hesitant rasp, barely audible above the mournful sigh of the wind as it snaked through the loose, rattling boards of the nearest derelict hovel. He didn't turn, not immediately. He was a study in profound stillness, broad-shouldered and lean, the very lines of his body speaking of a life carved from unforgiving landscapes, of battles fought and perhaps lost. The air around him felt colder, denser, as if he carried his own private, perpetual winter, a shield against the world. When he finally shifted, a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes, shadowed and deep-set beneath the brim of a stained, sweat-marked hat, found hers. They were the color of an impending storm, a turbulent grey-blue, holding a profound weariness that seemed to mirror the exhaustion etched into her own soul, yet beneath it lay a core of flint, hard and seemingly impenetrable. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" The words, each one a leaden weight, tumbled out, stark and deeply humiliating in the vast, indifferent silence. She expected dismissal, a harsh curse, perhaps even the swift, indifferent brutality of the back of his hand. It was the currency of her recent, wretched life. He surveyed her, a slow, deliberate, unnervingly thorough appraisal that stripped away her last, tattered vestiges of pride, leaving her feeling as exposed as the bleached bones of some forgotten animal in the desert. From her tangled, dust-caked hair, escaping the confines of a frayed, faded bonnet, to the almost imperceptible tremor in her dirt-stained hands clasped before her, to the raw, desperate plea held captive in the depths of her gaze. His face was all harsh angles and sun-etched lines, a stark, rugged map of solitude and perhaps, an unspoken, deeply buried sorrow. A scar, pale and jagged like a lightning strike frozen on bark, traced a distinct path from his left temple into the weathered leather of his cheek, a silent, stark testament to some forgotten, violent encounter. He said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, amplifying the incessant, frantic thrum of cicadas in the dry grass, the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling lazily in the metallic sky. Ilara held her breath, bracing herself for the inevitable rejection, the casual cruelty she had come to expect from the world. And then, he looked into her eyes, truly looked, his gaze bypassing the grime, the rags, the evident starvation. He looked deeper, into the flickering, defiant ember of spirit she fought so fiercely to keep alive amidst the ruins of her life. In that singular, suspended instant, something shifted in the charged atmosphere between them, an almost imperceptible tremor, like the first shift of earth before a quake. The formidable hardness in his gaze didn't vanish, not entirely, but it was pierced, just for a moment, by a flicker of something unreadable, something that was definitively not contempt, nor pity, but closer to a shared shadow, a mutual, unspoken understanding of pain that needed no words, no bridges. It was a recognition, perhaps, of a kindred desolation, a silent acknowledgement of the burdens they both carried. He straightened, a subtle movement, yet it seemed to make him fill the vast space around them even more completely. His hand, calloused and undeniably strong, brown from the sun, moved not to strike or dismiss, but towards the worn leather saddlebag slung across his horse's flank. The miracle wasn't a sudden choir of heavenly angels or a dramatic parting of the oppressive clouds, it was the simple, yet profoundly unexpected act of a man, evidently hardened and scarred by his own private demons, choosing, for a reason even he might not yet comprehend, not to turn away. The air still tasted of dust and despair, but for Ilara, a single, fragile, almost impossibly resilient seed of something other than abject hopelessness had just been sown into the barren, cracked ground of her existence. He hadn't spoken a single word, but the silence was no longer entirely empty, it held a question, a nascent possibility, and perhaps, the faintest, most tentative outline of an answer. He reached into the saddlebag, pulling out a canvas-wrapped parcel. He broke off a substantial piece of dried meat and a thick slab of bread, placing them silently on the trough's edge before turning to adjust his saddle, a deliberate act that offered her a moment of privacy for her desperate hunger. She ate, slowly at first, then with the voracity of the starved, the rough food a sacrament against the emptiness. He watched not her, but the horizon, his profile etched against the vast, indifferent sky, a man who understood deprivation, who offered sustenance without judgment, without a single spoken word to break the fragile tension that hummed between them like a taut wire. His quiet observation was a strange comfort, a sentinel presence in her desolate world, a silent promise against the encroaching darkness. His gesture was minimal, an inclination of his head towards his horse, then towards the vast, empty horizon that shimmered under the relentless sun. No words, an unspoken command, or perhaps, an invitation steeped in his usual reticence. Ilara, weak with hunger and a dizzying surge of fragile, disbelieving hope, simply nodded, her legs trembling beneath her thin skirt. He swung himself into the saddle with an economy of motion that spoke of long familiarity, the leather creaking a soft complaint against the sudden silence. He didn't offer her a hand up, nor did he wait to see if she would follow, an omission that spoke volumes of his solitary nature. He simply set his horse at a slow, deliberate walk, heading out of the dying town and into the brutal, beautiful expanse of the land. Ilara, summoning the last vestiges of her waning strength, stumbled after him, her gaze fixed on his broad back, a solitary, enigmatic figure receding into the shimmering heat haze, a beacon of uncertain promise. The journey was a blur of oppressive sun, swirling dust, and the rhythmic, hypnotic plodding of the horse's hooves. The landscape unfolded in stark, majestic monotony, rolling plains of sun-cured grass the color of old gold, jagged outcrops of rock the color of dried blood, and always, the immense, indifferent sky arching overhead like a faded canvas. It was a land that tolerated no weakness, a place where survival was a daily sacrament, demanding resilience and a hard heart. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting shadows and the growing, burning ache in Ilara's limbs. Finally, as the sun began its slow, spectacular descent, painting the western sky in hues of violent orange and bruised purple, a faint smudge appeared on the distant horizon. It resolved itself slowly into a cluster of low buildings, a ranch, stark and utterly isolated, nestled in a shallow dip of the land, protected on one side by a screen of gnarled cottonwoods clinging stubbornly to the banks of a mostly dry creek bed. There were no welcoming lights, no sounds of life save the mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves of the main cabin. It was a place built for solitude, a fortress against the world and its intrusions. Silas dismounted, his movements still economical, betraying no fatigue, and led his horse towards a rough-hewn corral. He didn't look at Ilara, didn't acknowledge her weary arrival as she finally limped into the dusty yard, her breath catching in her throat. He simply began to unsaddle his horse, his actions methodical, precise, as if she were merely an extension of the landscape. The silence here was different from the silence of the town. It was deeper, older, imbued with the profound weight of the wilderness, ancient and a little unsettling. Ilara stood uncertainly, clutching her meager bundle, the wind whipping strands of loose hair across her face. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs, chinked with mud, its windows small, like suspicious eyes observing her arrival. A plume of smoke, thin and grey, trickled from a stone chimney, suggesting a fire within, a spark of domesticity in the vast, untamed emptiness. After what felt like an eternity of strained silence, Silas emerged from the barn, carrying a bucket. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her once more, assessing, unreadable. Then, with another curt nod, this time towards a small, dilapidated outbuilding, a lean-to against the side of the barn, barely more than a shed, he gestured. "There," he said, his voice raspy from disuse, the single word striking her ear with the force of a pronouncement. It wasn't an invitation to the main house, not yet, perhaps never. But it was shelter. He walked to the cabin, disappearing inside without a backward glance. Ilara, her legs threatening to buckle, made her way to the shed. It was small, dusty, smelling of old hay and disuse, but it offered 4 walls and a roof, a barrier against the coming night and the prowling coyotes whose first tentative calls were beginning to pierce the twilight. A little later, as darkness fully enveloped the ranch, the cabin door opened, casting a rectangle of warm, yellow light into the yard. Silas stood silhouetted in the doorway. He placed something on the rough porch, a tin plate piled with stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a metal cup of water, then retreated back inside, the door closing with a soft thud. No words, no ceremony. Just sustenance. Ilara crept towards the offering like a wary animal. The stew was hot, rich with the taste of meat and vegetables. It was the best meal she'd had in months, perhaps years. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, the warmth spreading through her chilled body, a small counterpoint to the desolation that had been her companion for so long. From her makeshift shelter, she could see the faint glow of lamplight in the cabin window. He was in there, a man of scars and silence, a man who had offered a lifeline when all others had offered stones. The isolation was immense, terrifying in its own way, but tonight, it also felt like a shield. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, away from judging eyes and cruel whispers, perhaps trust, as fragile and tenacious as a desert flower, might find a sliver of barren ground in which to take root. He left the cabin door slightly ajar that first night, a sliver of lamplight reaching her small refuge, an unspoken signal that she was not entirely alone in the vast, dark wilderness that pressed in from all sides. It was a concession, small but significant, in the silent language they were beginning to share, a flicker of humanity in the heart of desolation. Days bled into weeks, each one a silent conversation written in deeds rather than words, a slow unfolding of unspoken understanding. The rhythm of the ranch imposed itself upon Ilara, a steady, grounding pulse of work and quietude. Silas rose before dawn, the muted sounds of his movements, the splash of water from the wash basin outside his door, the scrape of a boot on the rough floorboards of the cabin, her first awareness of the new day. He never spoke to her directly in those early mornings, never sought her out. He would leave a portion of whatever he'd cooked for himself, usually coffee, strong and black enough to strip paint, and day-old biscuits or a piece of jerked meat, on a clean stump near the lean-to. An offering, stark and unadorned, yet eloquent in its unwavering consistency. Ilara, in turn, began to find her own purpose within the confines of his solitude. The lean-to, initially just a refuge from the elements, slowly transformed under her touch. She swept it clean with a makeshift broom of stiff grasses bound with twine, mended a hole in the roof with salvaged pieces of canvas she found discarded near the barn, even managed to patch a gap in the wall with mud and straw, making it almost snug. She discovered a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, choked with weeds but showing faint signs of past cultivation. With a rusted hoe she unearthed from a shadowy corner of the barn, its handle smooth from forgotten hands, she began to clear it, her own hands, soft from disuse, quickly blistering, then callousing into toughness. Silas watched her, she knew, though his observation was always indirect, a fleeting glance from the corral as he worked with his horses, their coats gleaming in the morning sun, a longer look from the cabin window as he mended tack in the evenings, the lamplight etching his profile. He never commented, never offered help, but one morning, she found a small packet of seeds, beans and squash, left beside her breakfast portion, tucked beneath the tin cup. Another day, a worn but serviceable pair of leather gloves appeared, stiff but strong. These unspoken kindnesses were like small, steady drops of water on parched earth, slowly eroding the formidable defenses she had built around her heart. She, in turn, began to leave a pot of weak, brewed tea made from prairie herbs she identified from her childhood on the cabin porch late in the afternoons, or a carefully mended shirt of his, washed in the clear, cold creek and dried on a sun-warmed bush, its fabric smelling of wind and clean earth. Their communication was a fragile tapestry woven from these threads of action, a language understood in the spaces between the silences, more profound than any spoken words. One evening, a storm blew in from the west, a monstrous, churning wall of black cloud that swallowed the setting sun. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the lean-to, and rain lashed down in sheets, turning the dusty yard into a quagmire. Elara huddled inside, the thin walls offering scant protection against the tempest's fury. The door of the cabin opened, and Silas stood there, a lantern held high, its light cutting a defiant swathe through the tempest. He didn't speak, just jerked his head towards the main house, a silent, urgent summons. She hesitated for only a moment before gathering her meager courage and dashing through the deluge, the icy rain stinging her face. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but warm, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He gestured towards a stool near the fire. "Storm's bad," he rumbled, the first full sentence he'd directed at her in weeks, his voice deeper than she remembered. She nodded, unable to find her voice, her clothes soaked, her hair plastered to her face. He handed her a thick, woolen blanket, its texture rough but comforting. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the roar of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire within. She watched him, his profile stark against the firelight, the scar on his cheekbone thrown into sharp relief. There was a deep sadness in his eyes when he thought himself unobserved, a haunted quality that resonated with her own hidden sorrows. He caught her looking, and for an instant, their gazes locked. Not a challenge, not a question, but a moment of shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the storm raging both outside and, perhaps, within each of them. He looked away first, tending to the fire, but the intensity of that shared glance lingered in the warm air, a spark of connection in the vast wilderness of their isolation. As the storm slowly abated, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a sky full of stars, Elara felt a subtle shift. The walls between them, though still present, seemed a little less formidable. The silence they shared was no longer just an absence of words, but a space where understanding could begin to grow, tentative and fragile, like the first green shoots in her newly tended garden. His protection was a shield, his silence a strange kind of solace. Her resilience, her quiet determination to create something from nothing, seemed to call to something buried deep within him, a forgotten capacity for care. He began leaving small, carved wooden figures, a bird with outstretched wings, a resting wolf, surprisingly detailed, near her garden, tokens of an artistic inclination he kept hidden, much like his gentler emotions. She, in turn, would sometimes hum an old, half-forgotten tune as she worked, the melody drifting on the breeze, a soft intrusion into his guarded world, an offering of beauty he hadn't realized he missed until its faint notes reached him, stirring something dormant within his soul. The fragile peace of their shared solitude shattered with a sound as sharp and unwelcome as a gunshot in the dead of night, the jingle of harness and the thud of approaching hooves, too deliberate for stray cattle. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. Elara was weeding her small vegetable patch, the earth cool and damp beneath her fingers, a small measure of contentment finally settling in her heart like a tentative bird. Silas was chopping wood near the barn, the rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar, comforting backdrop to her days. He stopped mid-swing, his head snapping up, his body instantly alert, every line tense like a coiled whip. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, scanned the distance from where the sounds originated, a place few ever came. Elara felt a cold dread grip her. Visitors were an anomaly, almost an impossibility in their isolated world, and these sounds carried no friendly cadence. Silas strode quickly towards the cabin, his hand instinctively going to the Colt holstered low on his hip, the worn leather a familiar weight. "Inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl, devoid of its usual gruffness, now honed to a sharp edge of warning. "Stay down." And silent three riders emerged from the shimmering heat haze, coalescing into solid, menacing shapes. They were not cowhands or lost travelers. Their clothes were dark, their faces hard and unsmiling, and the way they carried their weapons spoke of a grim profession. Bounty hunters. Elara's blood ran cold. It had to be them, the men her cruel, powerful stepfather had undoubtedly sent to drag her back to a life she'd sooner die than endure, to face accusations fabricated to crush her spirit and steal her inheritance. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the vastness of the frontier had swallowed her whole, rendering her invisible. Silas stood on the porch, a formidable silhouette against the darkening wood of the cabin, his stance unyielding as ancient rock. The lead rider, a burly man with a face like a pitted rock and eyes like chips of obsidian, reined in his horse a few yards away, his mount snorting restlessly, sensing the tension. "We're looking for a woman," he snarled, his voice grating like unoiled gears. "Goes by the name of Ilara Vance. Seen her?" Silas didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was flat, devoid of emotion, cold as a winter wind. "No woman here by that name." "Just me." His gaze was steady, unwavering, a silent challenge. The bounty hunter spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, the brown stain spreading like a blight. "Don't lie to me, rancher. We got word she came this way. Skinny thing, haunted eyes. There's a hefty price on her head." He let his gaze drift pointedly towards the cabin, then to the small, tended garden, a splash of green against the dun earth, a clear sign of a woman's touch. Inside, Ilara pressed herself against the rough log wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The past she had run from had found her, and in doing so, had brought its ugliness to Silas's doorstep, endangering the one man who had shown her any semblance of kindness. Guilt and fear warred within her, a sickening tide. Suddenly, a memory, sharp and agonizing, pierced through Silas's stoic composure, a flicker in his eyes so brief Ilara, watching through a tiny crack in the wooden shutter, almost missed it. The audience sees it clearly, a fleeting, nightmarish image of a burning cabin, screams muffled by flames, the accusing eyes of a woman and child, his wife, his son, he couldn't save. His own past, his own devastating failure to protect, rose like a phantom, its icy breath on his neck. The bounty hunter, a keen observer of human weakness, sensed a shift, a crack in the rancher's formidable armor, and pressed his advantage. "We can do this easy, or hard. Your choice." Silas's hand hovered near his gun. The air crackled with unspoken violence. For him, this was more than just protecting a stranger, it was a desperate, visceral chance, perhaps, to exorcise an old demon, to rewrite a tragic ending that had haunted his every waking moment. But the risk was immense. He was one man against three, and these were not ordinary drifters, they carried the scent of death. Ilara knew she couldn't let him fight her battle, couldn't let him die for her. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a different emotion began to stir, a fierce, protective anger. She had been a victim for too long. No more. The turning point wasn't just the arrival of the external threat, it was the violent collision of their pasts, his profound guilt and her unjust persecution, forcing a terrible choice. Trust, so carefully nurtured in silence, now faced its crucible. Would he believe her innocence if she confessed? Would he still protect her if he knew the full extent of the danger she brought? And could she bear to see him risk everything for her? The bounty hunter's patience was wearing thin, his hand inching towards his own weapon. "Last chance, rancher. We know she's in there." He drew a worn, folded paper from his vest, a wanted poster, crudely printed but official-looking. He unfolded it deliberately, holding it up. "Recognize her? Reward still good." Dead or alive, Ilara saw the crude sketch of her face, a distorted caricature, chilling her. Official, damning. Despair, but also hardening resolve. Not like this. This sanctuary, this fragile piece, she would not see it destroyed because of her. She had to find a way to fight, not just for herself, but for the quiet man who had become her unlikely protector. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, the world holding its breath. Silas's eyes, chips of glacial ice, remained locked on the lead bounty hunter. The memory of flames, of his own past failure, fueled a cold, hard resolve within him. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not on his watch. Not to her. He'd seen the quiet strength in Ilara, the resilience that mirrored the tenacious prairie grass pushing through cracked earth. "She's not here," Silas stated again, his voice like stones grinding together. You best be moving on, the bounty hunter smirked, a cruel twisting of his lips. Figured you'd say that. He made a subtle gesture to his companions. Search the place. As the two flanking men began to dismount, Silas moved. It wasn't a sudden, jerky action, but a fluid uncoiling of lethal grace. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand, barking once, twice. One of the dismounting men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled back. The other froze, his hand halfway to his own weapon. The lead bounty hunter, faster than his bulk suggested, drew his own gun, firing wildly. A bullet splintered the porch post inches from Silas's head. The air erupted with the roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of gunsmoke instantly thick and choking. Inside the cabin, Ilara didn't hesitate. Her fear was still a living thing, but it was overshadowed by a desperate need to act, to fight. She wouldn't cower while Silas risked his life for her. Her eyes darted around the small room. Silas's spare rifle leaned in the corner. She'd seen him clean it, knew vaguely how it worked. Her hands, though trembling, were surprisingly steady as she grabbed it. It was heavy, unfamiliar, but she propped it on the windowsill, aiming through the crack in the shutter as Silas ducked behind a rain barrel for cover. He exchanged shots with the lead hunter, the bullets thudding into wood, whining through the air. The wounded man was trying to get back on his horse, his face contorted in pain. The third man, seeing his opportunity, raised his pistol, aiming at Silas's exposed back. "Silas!" Ilara screamed, her voice cutting through the din. At the same moment, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder, the recoil jarring her teeth, but her shot went true. The third bounty hunter grunted, his gun flying from his grasp as he spun around, shot through the leg. He collapsed, howling. Silas, alerted by her cry and the unexpected shot, whirled. He saw the downed man, then his gaze flicked to the cabin window, to Ilara, her face pale but resolute, the rifle still clutched in her hands. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, perhaps even awe, crossed his stoic features. The lead bounty hunter, momentarily distracted, gave Silas the opening he needed. Silas surged from behind the barrel, firing with deadly accuracy. The lead hunter staggered, dropping his weapon, his eyes wide with disbelief as he crumpled to the dust. Silence descended, abrupt and deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded men and the frantic whinnying of their horses. Silas stood, gun still raised, scanning the yard, his chest heaving. He lowered his weapon slowly. Ilara stumbled out of the cabin, the heavy rifle almost slipping from her grasp. Their eyes met across the small, battle-scarred space. The unspoken questions, the fears, the burgeoning trust, it all hung in the air, raw and exposed. He walked towards her, his expression unreadable. He stopped before her, his gaze intense. He reached out, not for the rifle, but to gently take her trembling hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She could only nod, tears finally spilling, tears not of fear, but of a profound, shattering release. He didn't let go of her hand. The remaining conscious bounty hunter, the one with the shoulder wound, was attempting to drag himself away. Silas looked at him with cold contempt. "Get on your horse. Take him with you," he commanded, gesturing to the man Ilara had shot. "And tell whoever sent you, tell them Ilara Vance died out here. Tell them this land protects its own." The wounded men, terrified and broken, managed to mount and ride away, leaving a trail of blood in the dust, their threat extinguished like a guttering candle. The sun was setting, bathing the ranch in a soft, golden light. The aftermath of violence lay heavy, but beneath it, something new had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. They stood together, watching the riders disappear, the silence now comfortable, intimate. He finally turned to her, his scarred face softened by an emotion she was beginning to recognize. "My name," he said, his voice quiet, "is Silas." Silas Blackwood. She met his gaze, a small, genuine smile finally gracing her lips. "Ilara," she replied, her own name feeling new, reclaimed. They began, wordlessly, to clean up the debris, to tend to the bullet holes in the cabin walls. The work was a balm, a way to reclaim their space, their peace. That night, she didn't return to the lean-to. He laid a blanket for her by the hearth, and they shared the small cabin, the silence no longer a barrier, but a bridge. In the days and weeks that followed, the ranch slowly healed. They rebuilt, replanted, their lives intertwining like the vines in Ilara's flourishing garden. The scars of their pasts remained, but they were no longer defining. Silas's hauntings began to recede, replaced by the quiet strength of Ilara's presence. Her fear gave way to a profound sense of safety, of belonging. They talked, sometimes, in quiet murmurs under starry skies, sharing fragments of their stories, easing each other's burdens. Home was no longer just a place, but a feeling, built on trust, respect, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of soils. The ranch thrived, and so did they, two solitary souls finding redemption and solace in each other, their quiet life a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to heal, to love, and to build anew, far from the world that had wronged them. Their peace was hard-earned, precious, and as enduring as the ancient land itself. The echoes of Silas Blackwood's quiet strength and Ilara Vance's resilient spirit linger long after their story concludes. They remind us that even in the harshest landscapes, both external and internal, compassion can be a lifeline, and courage can bloom in the face of despair. Their journey from desperate plea to shared peace teaches that true connection is often forged in silence and proven in shared adversity. If their tale of redemption and hard-won love in the unforgiving West has resonated with you, if you believe in the power of second chances and the quiet miracles that unfold when one soul truly sees another, then we invite you to become part of our community. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of human emotion and the enduring quest for belonging. Like this video if it touched your heart, and share it with others who appreciate tales of dramatic romance and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Your engagement helps us bring more such narratives to life.